and Junior Faculty Consortium. As a reminder, if you're just tuning in today for the first time, this is the second of 5 online sessions. My name is Thomas Greckhammer. I'm the chair of this year's consortium. And I would like to start out briefly by once again thanking our partners at Karma for their help in making this online format possible. Thanks very much to Larry Williams and his team for enabling our online sessions. And also thanks very much to Andrew Hanna, who is working here in the background. Andrew, could you show yourself just very briefly? He's the person who is making all the technical aspects of the online consortium possible and will help us. He's the guy who we're running to, crying if something fails with our technology. And also thanks once more to the track chairs of the consortium, Joanna Campbell from the University of Cincinnati, who is serving as this year's macro track chair, Jose Cortina from the Virginia Commonwealth University, who is this year's micro track chair, and Sanjay Jain from Cal State Northridge, who is this year's qualitative track chair. And the track chairs have worked very diligently on helping to put together a great program with outstanding panelists, such as the panel we have here today. Moving on to today's topic, we are talking today about new approaches to collecting and sourcing data. And we have an exciting panel here together. We have Aaron Hill from the University of Florida, who will be the first panelist. Then we have Scott Tonidandel from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who will be the second panelist, and will speak, I should say here also, on choosing the optimal items for shortened scale. And Aaron will speak on thinking creatively for new approaches to collecting and sourcing data, like providing a couple of ideas. And then last but certainly not least, we will have Stine Grodal from Boston University, who will speak on generating theory from data. And each of these panelists will have the optimal to them. We'll start with Aaron, and each of them will give us a brief presentation, and then we'll open up to our questions and answers. And so once we get to the question and answers, everybody in the audience is invited to write in their questions for the panelists using the Zoom group chat function. Now, having said this, and without further ado, I would like to turn over to Aaron, who will get us started. And I look forward to all the 3 presentations. Thanks. Aaron, please, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to presenting. I was a member of this PhD consortium when I was a PhD student, so it's nice to be back, and thank everyone for having me. I just left my camera on here so you can at least see who I am in case I see you at a conference or something. Feel free to say hello and introduce yourself. It's one of the things I like best about the field is kind of getting to know each other. So yeah, now you can put a face with a name. So now that kind of introductions are over, I'm going to switch to my presentation. Okay, I think you should be able to see now my slides. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. We see your slides.
Wonderful. Okay.
Sorry, you might want to just switch your display settings. It's showing the notes version instead of showing your.
Okay.
So go up to the top now, where it says display settings, and then just swap. Just do that.
There we go. Perfect. Now that our technical problems that are mine alone are solved, we'll get forward. So I'm Aaron Hill, University of Florida. My topic's on thinking creatively for new approaches. So by no means do I have all the answers. I'm hopefully just going to offer some insights on stimulating ideas for finding new data sources, essentially. So I'll start with just some opening caveats. We know that empirical research requires data. There's many approaches and considerations, and I'm going to just try and generalize some ideas, mainly across quantitative approaches. And before we do any of that, we should at least highlight a few research methodology basics. We're definitely always going to try and avoid threats to validity. So, certain data sets aren't going to work because they don't have good internal or external validity. And no matter what, our research question should drive our data design. All right, so we want to start with that. We have a research question. We're going to try and identify data. Now, of course, sometimes you have data and you have interesting findings. That's kind of a separate issue. That's okay too. These stylized facts can lead to some very important findings, but we're going to kind of start with, we have a question and we want to identify data. In doing that, there's definitely some trade-offs, and that's why this can be a little bit frustrating. This is kind of part science, part art. I'm referencing Bono and McNamara's work here. A nice editorial. If you have any questions, it's an AMJ, and I'll provide the sites at the end of this. But there's various factors that are going to affect our ability to kind of have an optimal design. We don't want to compromise our fundamentals too much, but we're going to have to kind of find this match of art and science where we find data that matches our question. Also, issues of temporality. We want to be able to match theory and operationalization. We definitely need sound measures and models, etc. But we're also going to have to make some compromises, and we'll try and identify some areas where maybe, hey, this is a unique way we can do that. There's also some practical trade-offs, all right? Gathering data takes time, and there's an opportunity cost. We have to make a decision on when we have enough data, all right? So maybe we've done study 1, study 2, and we think the paper's ready. There's no optimal decision, but it can raise some concerns. Third, like many of us, we're using similar data. If you're an OB scholar, a lot of people are using experiments. A lot of people are doing surveying in the field. So, how can you differentiate yourself? If you're a strategy scholar, many people are using words data. So what can we do to get our foot in terms of something unique? This data is often costly. We may lack a budget, all right? And the bar seems to be getting higher. It's now more on the macro side. It now seems that they want 2 sources of data. Maybe it's going to be 3 OB. That's certainly the trend. So altogether, this can kind of give us a headache. And hopefully the point of today is, first of all, there's reason for optimism. It's not going to be easy, but there's lots of opportunities. And my goal is to provide you some ideas, mainly about thinking creatively. Hopefully it'll stimulate some of your ideas, and then also some practical considerations. And I guess to try and put this into a larger context, given you may have a headache, if you've seen the commercials, there used to be a series of commercials, I had a headache this big, Excedrin will solve it. So hopefully this is a minor version of Excedrin here. Okay. Before I delve into it too much, I want to offer a quick PSA. So it's a play on words, a public service announcement or public service advertisement, but also positive self-affect. You may have heard a story that if a bear's chasing you in the woods, you don't have to be the fastest runner to get away from the bear. You just have to be faster than the others. So the fact that you're here, you're kind of getting ahead of the pack. So consider that's a pretty positive first step. Second, there's new tools being developed all the time. And those of us in the nascent stage of our career, we're well positioned to leverage them. For example, drone technology. Think of all the opportunities that it presents, and who are the people that are most familiar with some of that stuff? It's the newer scholars. At the same time, those newer scholars, you don't have the blinders that maybe some experienced scholars have. So you're more open potentially to see some of these new data sources and opportunities. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. Third, Bono and McNamara said this is part art and part science, and the good news is you can improve at both of them. I'm a big sports fan, so I really like this quip from Allen Iverson, practice. We can definitely practice over time and get better at this. And then kind of a final caveat here, I'll try and intersperse a few personal stories. I'm sensitive to that coming across as self-congratulatory or as I have all the answers, but I'll at least give you some examples of some successes that I've had in this and also some pitfalls that I've had to hopefully provide you some insights. Okay, so thinking creatively about data. So after we map out our optimal design, we know that things aren't going to be perfect, so we're going to just try and give you some ideas. First approach is to ask who might have this data on hand. Archival data is not just for macro scholars. There's lots of data out there on micro-based questions. Firms have tremendous data on hiring and retention. If you're on the more HR type questions, firms are now getting into psychometric assessment. There's all sorts of data. So, one way to think about data is to ask who might have this. At the same time, you have a network of people who likely want to help if you ask them. Second, you have aligned interests. Firms need these questions that we're addressing answered too. So there can be mutually beneficial things between you and those who have the data. And third, you have skills to offer in return. So you might be able to access data by simply asking who has it, using social networks and saying, hey, I'm looking for data on these things, or if you're interested in answering questions about X, please let me know. And you never know who might answer. I've actually had some luck just cold calling people and saying, hey, I have this question. I think it would benefit you. Is this something you're interested in working together with? One study I worked on the NFL, the National Football League, and data on the movement of their coaches and how that affected strategies. And I was able to work with the NFL to compile a database of all their coaches. They had it, they just didn't have it organized. So what I offered them was organizing data that was relatively easy to organize. And then I could send them back out. Here's all the coaches that you've had and where they've worked in the history of the NFL from your own records. And it wasn't that much work for me to organize that. So, think of you offer something in return and just pitching someone may be able to help. Number 2 or B, you might want to ask who would benefit. Our research should change knowledge, and others have vested interest in this. So again, you have a network who likely wants to help. You again have aligned interests with these people, and you have skills to offer in return. So remember those points. 3, you're going to have to make some realistic concessions. Bono and McNamara highlight that pretty well. So you might want to ask what's realistic, and that will give you an idea on maybe sources of data that aren't realistic because the concessions are too great, and sources of data where, hey, here's a realistic concession that this can give me some data that I can use. So again, a given design might not be optimal, but maybe you can answer some questions with the data set, and at the same time, you can compensate for the weakness of one context or study design with the strengths of another. Okay? So we should think of this more as research design, not a study design. So you may be able to think of, hey, this data isn't perfect for this question, but can it help me a little way and down the path, and I could augment it with another approach, all right? The word data is plural. It's not singular. So you may want to think, okay, this particular data set can get me part of the way to my question. Maybe I need to augment it with another. And I think we're seeing that more and more, partially because we can't address everything with one data set potentially. So you can answer some questions or provide some insights and then get better with augmenting that with another data source. So think about realistic concessions that may be able to help you. Okay. So far, since we're talking about creativity here, I tried to do something creative. If you've never heard this song, there's a link which I'll send you. You can listen to an oldie from the Jackson 5, but hopefully this is a mnemonic that helps you. ABC. Okay. So after we map out our optimal design, ask archives. Is it available somewhere? Benefit. Who might benefit? C, concessions and compensate. Can we make reasonable concessions but then compensate for it with another data source? And then it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. So if you know the song, it's ABC, easy as 1, 2, 3. You have a network, you have aligned interest and skills to offer. Those are really powerful things. Okay, so don't be dismayed. Okay, if you go with continuing the song, this may be a bit of a stretch, but does do, re, mi mean like dominate research methods or just do research methods? So not to be too quirky, but either way, I think this applies because we're going to go right back to the song. So we have ABC 1, 2, 3. After you do the first ABC 1, 2, 3, ask yourself again, ABC, are there alternative approaches that I can use? So I'm a macro scholar. I'm mostly used to using archival data and longitudinal analysis, but can an experiment help me? Can a survey help me? And alternatively, if you're a survey, or an experimenter? Can another approach help you? If so, again, we may want to get multiple data sources here. So consider alternatives. Don't just put the blinders of our own familiarity. B, you have tons of skills and you may not even realize that. So ask how you might be able to build a needed data source. I think one of the reasons Joanna asked me to participate in this is I've built a data source of CEOs over time as a means to assess their psychological traits. I used videos. And where that idea came from, in part, was that I was a basketball coach for a few years and I cut tape. So I was able to kind of isolate videos. I moved from cutting tape as basketball into doing production of videos. So I could take out things like the names, and I had that skill, and I was able to leverage that for research. So you might have a skill that you could leverage as well. So think about what you have and how you might build a needed data source. Maybe something you can leverage for 2 or 3 studies, and it may be something that's unique. And then 3, I think as young scholars, we often make mistakes by thinking we have to do all the work ourselves. Ask co-authors, ask confidants, ask casual acquaintances, anyone who's really competent. You never know what might come of it. Tell them what you're researching on, tell them what your interests are. You know, there's a lot of people out there who, again, they have aligned interests simply because they like you or want to help you. Selfishly, they may want to help themselves. So just letting people know what you're working on and asking can be one way to generate unique data sources. Okay, and again, 1, 2, 3, you have your network, you have interests aligned, and you have skills. So remember that. Those are really powerful things. All right. So a summary of the song, there's archives, there's mutual benefit, there's concessions and compensate, use your network, align skills, skills to offer in return, and then alternatives, build data, and all the other C's. All right. So hopefully the song gives you something to remember. ABC, 1, 2, 3, ABC, 1, 2, 3. Now as we're doing this, I want to give you some practical considerations too. New data sources are often outside the norm, and that means you may get pushback from reviewers. So you need to consider dedicating additional space to explaining this, but also some things that you might want to consider as you're gathering the data, which I'll go through next. So those are just a few thoughts in the process. 1, know your data and method really well. So when I use the NFL, for example, I can explain that, hey, I worked with the NFL head office and had access to their personnel records. When I did data on baseball, again, I'm a sports fan, so I could say, hey, this is what this stuff is actually capturing. The videos, I came to know it really intimately, so you can identify issues both in collecting the data and also in explaining to reviewers, like, hey, these are potential things that someone may ask, so you can identify that up front. 2, be very systematic and keep track of everything. You're going to be a few years into this, and you're going to be asked to provide detail on what you did 2 or 3 years ago, or you're going to have an R&R and you don't remember exactly how you measured something, it wasn't entirely clear. So really develop a process of being systematic and keep track of everything. Save it multiple places. Ultimately, you should be able to share the source of your data and the steps that you used so others can replicate it from a reasonable source. So you should be able to walk through step by step. It's often kind of a boring part of the paper to write, but it's vitally important. To do this, you should develop a system and use it and improve it. The more we do one thing, the better we'll get at it. It'll become second nature. When we start to do too many different approaches, I think it leads to error that then leads to problems in your data and or leads to red flags for reviewers that you can't answer succinctly, and that's a problem. So really develop a system and improve it. And 4, continue to learn new techniques as needed, but also leverage your 1, 2, 3. We can't be an expert in every approach or every data source. You know, we're boundedly rational people, and it's inefficient to try and do everything. So, you know, kind of balance this. There's trade-offs. You do want to keep fresh with skills and learn things, but if you leverage co-authors, you leverage other people, you don't have to know everything. 5, consider your matching. This is important, OB strategy, whatever it is. Identifiers may change over time. For example, people get married, People use a nickname or initials or something. Lots of things can happen. There's alphanumeric and numeric, and it can create all sorts of different matching issues. So try and get as much information as you can the first time. It'll help you with matching when you have to go back and add control variables or add additional data. The more information you have, the better. And numeric data, if it's numbers, can often create problems when you import it into a data analysis. It just turns it into a number. When you maybe the 0 at the start, 0, 1 is different from 1, or 0, 1 has meaning, and it may drop that out. So be very concerned about the type of data identifier you use. So if you have a number, consider saving it as text so that the number doesn't convert. It'll also prevent you from maybe having an issue in your analysis. As you download data, consider format. Certain formats, if you have tabs or commas or too many spaces, will have problems in data analysis. So again, as you're developing techniques, you may want to consistently develop a way, whether you use all lowercase letters or underscores, develop your own formula to kind of consider some of the problems up front. Always duplicate, always be concerned with cleaning and cross-checking. Look, we're all human and errors happen, particularly in data set that's kind of one-time use or isn't developed for this use. Like even CompuStat, which is combed through by a lot of people, has errors. So our own data is probably going to have them too. To the extent we can clean and cross-check, we'll be better off in the long run. And then again, kind of circling back, alternatives and compensate for weaknesses. Think of alternative approaches to assess robustness when you're collecting data, whether that's different forms of a measure or different conceptualizations, different data sets. It can definitely help in the long run. So that's kind of it. After we map out an optimal design, we got to compromise our fundamentals a little, but don't compromise too much. It's, again, part art, part science. As you do that, this may seem like a lot, but keep a good positive self-attitude. We can learn this and we'll get better. Remember, it's easy as ABC 1, 2, 3. You get the drift from the hopefully creative and reasonably entertaining analogy. I don't know. But you can do this. It's something that we can all get better at. And then be concerned with effective practical implementation. Because where the rubber meets the road, there's going to be a lot of minor problems. And to the extent that our practical implementation of some of these creative ideas can be tightened, I think we'll be better off. Thank you. I hope that was helpful. I look forward to feedback and questions, and hopefully this provides some excedrin to your headache or concerns over data sources going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. And I'll be opening up now the floor, if you will, the virtual floor for questions. We have a few minutes here for questions for Aaron, so please use the chat function here for any questions that you would want to address here to Aaron. He has covered a lot of ground here and a lot of ideas in terms of how to think about data and putting together data. So any questions you have, this is the time.
All right. Okay. What are your thoughts on online data and social media, etc.? So one of again, Joanna, I think, asked me to this because I did the CEO videos. I think is one of the things where people thought, hey, that was kind of creative. So the question is, for those who can't see it, what are your thoughts on online data and social media? I have a pretty broad take on data. I think no data is bad data. All data has issues. So you might think, hey, the gold standard is experiments. Well, even experiments have some problems. Or, hey, surveys are airtight if I have good measures. Well, they have problems too. So online data, you just want to be concerned with the clarity of it and how you can remove validity threats. Same with social media. You know, does it match your conceptualization? If it's something like, this is how people responded, or this is information that firms have used, that's a pretty concrete thing that they're using. So I think it's valuable, just be concerned with validity.
Aaron?
The next one. Do you have any unique examples of data reshaping your research question or model? So the question is, has data ever reshaped my question or model? And explain the process you went through to avoid data mining issues. So this is a broad question. It's a little bit philosophy of science. It's a little bit an issue I want to tread lightly on, because I know some people have some very stringent beliefs on whether we should have stylized facts or whether we should HARK. And I don't want to say that those are ever bad ideas, because sometimes you're going to go through a review process and reviewers themselves are going to ask you to HARK. They're going to say, hey, add this hypothesis or add this, test this other idea. So you have to be a little practical that we're not going to have everything perfect the first time. That said, when you have a question in mind up front, I think try and be as thorough as you can on what you're trying to get the first time. And that should kind of walk you down a path that may inductively open up other doors too. So I think having clarity up front doesn't mean you can't open up to new ideas as you have the data.
Okay.
What do you think about websites like Prolific Academic? I'm unfamiliar with that website, but hopefully my general tenor would be all data is good data. It's something you can use to the extent that it matches your question and is reasonably valid. I think you can use it. Just try and be concerned with the validity, and that's going to be internal. Does it measure what you say it's measuring? And external. Does this apply to other contexts? If you can just think of those really simple internal and external validity issues, I think that'll answer a lot of your data questions. And then if it has one of those concerns, can you compensate with another data source?
So I think that's very useful, the notion of connecting considerations of data to research questions, right? And any evaluation of the data source, as you know, that should be taken in respect to the question that people have. So he has a question about cold calling companies.
Yeah, question about cold calling. So I've had success and failure with this. Successes I've had were the NFL data, the data for Major League Baseball that I used in a paper. I had some success on getting some compensation data from a firm, and I basically called and tried to be send an email and then follow up with a call, and in your email say, hey, I'm going to follow up with a call. So try to hit them a couple ways, but have a succinct pitch. Like, think of the emails you get. You really don't want to read more than 2 or 3 lines. You need to introduce yourself succinctly. You need to kind of say what you want and say how it's going to benefit them, and be pretty succinct. Hey, I'm looking at this. I have this question that I think could benefit from you. Are you interested in chatting? That's all you really need to do, is you need to get a person on the phone so you can explain what you're trying to do, but also assuage their fears. I think a lot of people think that by research, they mean a New York Times op-ed where we're going to say the name of the firm and the manager. They don't understand that we want to abstract it out and really not have any tie to the actual firm or manager. But you got to get someone on the phone. So have a good pitch. Practice your pitch. Be succinct and try and get a conversation going. In that pitch, you should try and really tell them how they benefit. They don't need to know that you're going to benefit by trying to publish research. You can just say, hey, I'm interested in this question, and I think I can help you with it too. I don't know if that helps, but.
That's great. So there's actually a natural break here right now in the questions. So I would like to transition to the next panelist. So thank you again here to Aaron for a presentation filled with very good ideas. And if we have some time left at the end of the panel, there may be an opportunity still to address a question to Aaron. So please let me help you here. Please help me here virtually to shout out to Aaron once more for a great presentation. And with that, I would like to transition to Scott Tonidandel here, who is the second panelist and who will speak on the optimal items for a shortened scale. I very much look forward to this presentation. I personally don't do any survey-related research, but it's something that I think is very often coming up in research. So I'm looking forward to that topic. Scott, the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas. So I'm Scott Tonidandel from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. I'm a professor of management there, and I'm going to talk about scale shortening. So let's do it. All right, so hopefully everybody can see this. You can see that this is has a bunch of different collaborators on it. It's actually a culmination of about 3 different projects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we sort of got into this research question, talk about some of the issues involved with shortening a scale and why you might want to do it, and then hopefully provide you with a useful tool that will allow you to do it much more effectively. All right, so this work all got started with a paper that recently just got released online in Journal of Management that I did in collaboration with Eric Hegestead and others on scale adaptations. So one of the things that we saw in our literature is that people are often adapting existing scales for their own research. And so we wanted to sort of understand that process and see what was going on. So what we did was we coded every scale in every article in JAP, JOM, AMJP Psych over a 2-year period. So we're talking just over 2,000 scales, 264 articles. And we found that this scale adaptation happens quite frequently. 81% of the articles that were published in these journals had at least one adapted scale. 46% of the scales, so that's just over 1,000 of these scales, just around 1,000 of these scales, were reported as being adapted. And then when you dig a little deeper, you find that one of the most common adaptations of these scales is shortening them. So 8% of scales used were described as being shortened. And these were sort of self-reported numbers. So basically the author says, we took this existing scale, we shortened it, and used this many items. But this doesn't really capture how frequently shortening is happening in our literature. We actually had a follow-up study where we took 6 commonly used scales and we coded every use of those scales since their inception. And remember, in study 1, we found that about 8% of scales are reported as being shortened. Well, in study 2, when we actually tracked the scales so we knew how long they're supposed to be, and we saw how long the authors said they were in their articles, we found that depending on the scale that you're talking about, somewhere between about 20% and 65% of administrations involve shortening the original measure. So what does this mean? Well, this means that shortening is really common. And it's so common that authors frequently don't even mention doing it. So 8% of the time they say they did it, but really, somewhere around 50% of the time they're probably doing it. So essentially, this has become accepted practice. So people are shortening scales and not even mentioning it, basically. So, again, why is this happening? Why is it so common? Well, if we look at some general trends over time, in order for us to make a theoretical contribution to our manuscripts, we need to have more boxes and arrows, basically. So we need more constructs, maybe we need more measurement occasions, like an experience sampling. But either way, what we need is we need more measurements. Okay, so if we have more measurements, we've got these respondents who don't really have any more additional time to respond. So essentially what we need is we need shorter scales. So the question then becomes, well, is shortening a problem? Well, we actually had a third study in this JOM piece where we surveyed editorial board members and psychometric experts on their reactions to various adaptations. So we gave them a bunch of scenarios that they rated with all sorts of different adaptations, but one of those adaptations had to do with shortening scales. Actually, 2 of them did. And basically what we asked the participants was we said, well, from a psychometric measurement perspective, to what extent do you feel that the adaptation is problematic? And again, it would have said that scale shortening or whatever the specific adaptation was for that scenario. And then to what extent are you concerned that the changes you made to the scale might affect the construct validity of your resulting scores? And here's sort of an example of one of those scenarios for scale shortening. You know, you can imagine this being a little brief paragraph in a method section where you're describing the measure that you use. So you took this 28-item measure and you administered 7 items. So that's the basic idea. And the question is, what do members of the editorial board think about this? What do psychometric experts think about this? Well, if you take a look at what we found that across both of those items and for both samples, so really psychometric experts and the editorial board members were in agreement that the most troublesome adaptations related to scale shortening. So essentially, everyone thinks that this is a problem. They're very concerned about this issue of taking existing scales and shortening them down. So what do we know from this JOM piece? Well, we know that scale shortening is a frequent occurrence, and we know that it is a worrisome practice. Okay, so why is this a problem? So why is scale shortening a problem? Well, essentially the idea here is when you take an existing validated measure and you remove items, you are potentially affecting the construct coverage, which then goes on to threaten the validity of that scale. And importantly, people are not providing any validity evidence when they are doing these scale adaptation things. Okay, here's actually, in addition to responding to a series of questions about the scenarios, we also gave people an opportunity to sort of free response their reactions to some of the adaptations. And here's one of the reactions we got from a psychometric expert around scale shortening. So this individual said that they would get a lecture from me on the construct validity process with a particular focus on content validity. I would question the validity of any of the inferences using that measure. However, they could address this by undertaking separate studies where they evaluate the psychometric properties of the shortened scale. Without that evidence, though, I would reject the paper. So clearly that we think that this is a problem. All right. Now, then the next question becomes, well, how are people shortening their scale? So when people reduce it down, we know what decisions are they making to come up with a set of items that they're using. And we don't really know the answer to that question, but we are pretty sure that they're making selections in an effort to maximize alpha. So one of the things that we did was we went back and we looked at these scales from the Hegestead et al. Article where they reported reliability information. So that's, again, almost about 2,000 scales. And we found that alpha was largely unaffected by scale length in these articles. And that would be entirely inconsistent with measurement theory. So we would expect shorter scales to have lower internal consistency reliability, and that just isn't happening. So that suggests that people are picking and choosing items that will maximize alpha. Okay, so that's sort of the strategy that they're pursuing. In some more recent work that we're working on in collaboration with Jose Cortina and some of his students at VCU, we've actually got some more evidence around these decisions. So we've gone ahead and coded every article published in JAP, and we looked at 2 different time points. So we looked back in 1989, and if you look at the correlation between scale length and alpha, you see a moderate correlation of about 0.3 in 1989, and you see a correlation of about 0 in 2017. And if you look specifically at scales that are shortened or identified as being shortened in those articles, you see that in 1989, you see a pretty strong relationship between the number of items and scale length. And in 2017, you see a pretty weak relationship between those 2 things. And again, that's pretty inconsistent with what we would expect from a measurement perspective. And therefore, it suggests that people are essentially making decisions about their measures based on alpha. They're basically saying, hey, is my alpha above this arbitrary threshold of 0.7? Does the face validity look okay? If it does, then that is sort of the beginning and the end of their scale evaluation. All right, now you might say, well, what's wrong with this strategy? You know, why can't I use alpha as my rule for deciding if I've got a good shortened scale? And the answer to that question is so many things. Not sure where to even begin responding to that. So one thing that's pretty obvious is that alpha is really only one aspect of scale quality. In this case, just measuring internal consistency reliability. There are all sorts of other attributes of scale quality that are important. if we just think about it as a measure of internal consistency, alpha is actually a flawed measure compared to alternatives that exist. For example, Gutman's lambda 2 shows less bias compared to alpha and would be a better measure. Now, why is it that we use alpha? Well, because when these indices were developed, alpha was much more computationally efficient over lambda 2. And so what we decided was we would trade accuracy for convenience. But now that we have these handy-dandy little computer things that can do all these computations really fast, we really should think about reconsidering that decision and relying on tools that are better, more accurate indicators of internal consistency. So one takeaway might be, hey, let's stop reporting alpha and instead report something like lambda 2. But again, the problems of alpha don't end there. Alpha is largely driven by essentially the number of items and the average inter-item covariance. So it doesn't really give you any evidence of unidimensionality. Better alternatives exist if that's the question that you want to address. Omega or omega h, where omega h is the proportion of variance attributed to the factor that's common to all items, would be a great indicator of that and something that we should perhaps all examine when we're trying to evaluate the quality of our scale. But again, we don't do that. I'm not going to go into detail about some of these indices other than to say, you can see Cho and Kim for a more detailed discussion of different statistics that are available to answer these kinds of questions. All right. So the question then becomes, well, how should researchers shorten their scale? Well, an ideally shortened scale is one that simultaneously attends to a variety of different criteria. So yes, we want good reliability. Again, not necessarily alpha, but we want good reliability. We want our shortened scale to be unidimensional. We want our shortened scale to have a strong correlation with the total scale. We'd like to maximize convergent validity. We'd like to minimize our correlations with things that are measuring something else. So all of these things should probably be a piece of our evaluation of a shortened scale when we want to shorten it. In addition, we also want to think about that issue of content coverage, right? So again, if we just choose items that will maximize reliability, what are we going to do? We're going to tend to pick up items that are essentially identical items with only minor wording changes, and we are not going to perhaps capture the breadth of the construct that we're interested in. All right, so how can we help researchers do this? So when we were thinking about recommendations in this JOM piece for shortening a scale, it occurred to me that this notion of scale shortening really matches Pareto optimization. So what is Pareto optimization? Well, it's a process whereby one simultaneously attends to multiple criteria to determine the optimal solution. And if you go back and look at that last slide, that's really what I'm talking about. I'm saying, hey, we want to simultaneously attend to, our reliability, our content coverage, our convergent validity, our discriminant validity, and so on when deciding what our optimal solution is. So it sort of matches that kind of problem. So to me, that sounds like what we want to do, but I would say it sounds hard. If only it were easy. Well, here's our attempt to make it easy. Introducing the scale shortening R Shiny app. So as many of you know, I have taught for many years an introduction to R short course at Karma. Doing it again this January down at University of South Carolina. But what most people are probably less familiar with is what R Shiny is. And R Shiny is this free product made by RStudio where you can create interactive applications that sort of interface with RStudio or R in the background, and you don't need to know R programming to use it. And basically, there are these web-based applications that you can deploy on the web, and anyone can sort of come in and use it and take advantage of the power and sophistication of R without having to do all of the coding yourself. So I'm going to show you our new R Shiny app. I really need a better name. Jose, who's collaborating with me on a bunch of these things, has given me a suggestion. He says we should call it Cutting or Reducing Tests is Now Automatic. If you want to know why, it's because it now becomes the Cortina. All right, so what does the Cortina do? Well, essentially what this app does is it takes some pilot data. So you really need to have some sort of pilot data in order to figure out, how you might want to optimize a shortened version of the scale. But I don't think this is a really high bar. It's super easy to collect survey data now. In under an hour on something like mTurk, you can collect hundreds of responses to survey items from, all sorts of different kinds of samples. That will let you sort of feed that data in to create an optimized shortened version of the scale. What this app does is it will take that pilot data and it will churn through all these possible subsets of that scale and spit out all the different kinds of indicators that will hopefully let you choose what the optimized version will be. So we're going to take a look at that with an example. This is an example around conscientiousness. So let's say that I want to use the BASF, which has a measure of conscientiousness in it. And there are 20 items with 2 content areas, industriousness and orderliness. And so what I would do is I would take this 20-item measure. I might administer it to an mTurk sample. I might collect some other information on like convergent validity. Maybe I'll give the NEO PI to get some additional conscientiousness data that I can look at convergent validity. Maybe I'll give some other instruments as well. Could also look at divergent validity, discriminant validity, etc. All right, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint here and jump over into my app. All right, and I'm just going to refresh it and start from the beginning. So just to be clear, this is sort of a beta version of the app. We're still building out some functionality, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that you could do with this app. So what you might do is you might browse to your pilot data. Now, what's really sweet about our Shiny is it has a sort of adaptive interface where when I make selections over here, things update over here. So this just gives you a snippet of your data. So you can see that I've got my 20 items there going across, plus I've got a few other columns.
Scott,
yes.
Just for information, we're still seeing your slides.
You're still seeing my slides. Well, that's super helpful. Let me totally exit out PowerPoint. How about now?
Yes.
You can see my app? Okay, I'm going to restart.
We see the app. So if
all right, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to browse to some data. Here's some pilot data that we collected on this, and you'll see that when it reads in the data, it adapts and it'll change the menus and it'll present some data as it goes. So it's sort of a snippet of my data. You can see I've got my 20 items there, plus some information that I can use for convergent and discriminant validity. This gets populated by the names in my data set automatically. So again, it's pretty slick. Because this process sort of iterates through all possible subsets, it can take a while with a lot of items. So I'm not going to feed it all 20, but I'm just going to feed it sort of a subset of 12 items. I'm going to grab some from the industriousness and some from the orderliness construct. So here are 12 items that I'm going to feed in. So let's say I had a 12-item scale that I wanted to shorten, and I only got time to give 4 items. So I'm going to shorten this to 4 items. I can feed it information about convergent validity. So there's the NEO conscientiousness. Maybe I measured some other stuff here. So in this case, I measured generalized self-efficacy. So I want to see that I get some discriminant validity with generalized self-efficacy. And I'm going to hit submit so it can churn through all the different possible subsets. We've got some other options here where you can just set cutoffs for what results you want displayed. So right now, we're only displaying those sets who have an alpha above 0.7. And so you can see that it populates all of the different options. So we've got 210 different sets of items in which we get a reliability above 0.7. Notice it's presenting lambda 2 here, so you can compare that. The part-whole correlation, this R validity is the convergent validity, this is the discriminant validity. And you can see, if you just look at that very first set right there, you can see that, hey, I've got a pretty decent alpha there. It's approaching 0.8. Maybe that's the set I want to use. But interestingly enough, if you take a look at that set, you'll see, well, my convergent validity with another measure of conscientiousness is also 0.5. My discriminant validity with generalized self-efficacy is also 0.5. So that's actually a pretty terrible set to be using. Yet, if I was just focused in on something like alpha, that might be what I would use. And you can do things in this app, like you can sort it by like, hey, convergent validity. So that first set happened to be the lowest convergent validity. But you can see I can get these sets that have higher convergent validity, in this case, 0.846, so much better. In addition, this app lets you do things like map into content areas. So I said that this measure that I'm using has both industriousness and orderliness. So I can say, hey, I want to map content areas. There are 2 of them. So the first 6 variables are part of one of those. The second 6 variables are part of the other content area. And I can say, hey, I've got a 4-item measure, but I want to make sure at least 2 of my items come from each of those. So I can say submit. And you can see that that happens really quick because that just pulls from my original database that I've already iterated through. And it just pulls the ones that match this criteria of having 2 items from each of those 2 sets. And you can see that this very first set that gets pulled out here, I do have an alpha above my, 0.7 cutoff, but you can see here I'm immediately drawing on a set that has a very high convergent validity of 0.8 and a much, much lower discriminant validity of 0.44. So that would obviously be a much better set to use than the first one that I had identified. In addition to that, you can do things like take item polarity into account. So some of these items are positively phrased, and some of them are negatively phrased. So I could say, yes, I want to take that into account. And I would just have to indicate, well, which variables are the positive and negative ones. I think there's something like this, just going from memory. And I could say, well, I want, I got 4 items, so maybe I want 2 of them to be reverse scored. So I could say submit. And again, it will sort of restrict my set down to a smaller set of items, like so. So you can see that this set sort of matches the criteria that I put forward. And again, I could sort it based on other criteria that I cared about or wanted to emphasize. Now, I said that this was sort of a beta version, so we don't have this posted publicly available for use. We're also building in the capacity to include omega H in here as well, so we'll get an index of unidimensionality in here very shortly. I'd just like to remind people that, again, don't focus too much on these numbers because they are a function of sampling. So we're also going to try and include some information about like the standard errors of some of these things. So you can say, oh, well, is there really that much of a difference between 0.804 and 0.813? Probably not. But it gives you sort of the sets you might want to look at. So that is the R-Shiny scale shortening app, and hopefully some ideas to think about beyond just an alpha above 0.7 when wanting to shorten your respective scales.
Great, thank you, Scott. And we'll again wait here for questions from the audience. We have a couple of minutes for questions. And while questions are coming in, perhaps I'll ask a question. You said the app is at this point not available?
So we haven't posted it officially yet because we're still trying to add a couple little niceties into it. But I'm sure if somebody reached out to me in the next month or two, I could definitely do it. It's related to a paper that's under review as well, so it'll be out there.
Okay, great. All right, any questions on scale shortening?
It looks like I got a message sent just directly to me asking about cutoffs, various subsets. Again, I mean, I'm not much of a fan for arbitrary cutoffs. Again, it seems like our field has adopted this alpha cutoff of 0.7, but we know that to be sort of faulty in general. But I think that rather than saying, oh, I need a particular threshold for any of these things, I think you want to, again, sort of take a more gestalt view and look across all of the different indices that the app's providing and say, okay, well, when I think about which of these subsets I want, again, I want a good alpha, but I might be willing to sacrifice a little bit in terms of my alpha to ensure that I'm getting really good convergent discriminant validity and my part total correlation is really good, and so
on. The output of the Shiny app.
Let's see. So I think initially when I first press submit, I think it's just done based on how the sets are created. So the program's basically going to index all of the possible subsets, and it's just going to present those in that order. But then you can very quickly narrow down which ones you want, either by using the sort buttons at the top, or if you saw on the left-hand side of the app, there were a bunch of options that I didn't tweak, but where I had alpha of 0.7, I was only presenting alphas above 0.7. I could say, I want an alpha above 0.7, I want convergent validity above 0.8, I want discriminant validity below 0.4, and all of a sudden you can get down to a pretty narrow set and see what your options are.
Okay, any other questions that we have here?
I mean, I think the main takeaway here is we really want people to think about shortening a scale, not just do it arbitrarily, not just look at the face validity of items and stick them together and say, okay, well, now I've got a good valid scale, because you really need to provide some additional evidence, and we really need to think more holistically about this process.
Well, I can say, Scott, as a non-survey researcher, or for that matter, as a non-quantitative researcher, I really appreciate this work and this topic very much, because working with students or reviewing papers in a variety of manners, it's, to me, a topic that is very salient and comes up very often, where people shorten scales. And even as I said, as a non-expert, I'm always wondering, how did you do that, or how did you decide on that? And so I think this is a really important contribution that you are making here with this work.
Thanks.
Well, there are no questions coming in right now, so I suggest that we move on to the last panelist, and then if there are any questions still coming, maybe at the end we can revisit them. Again, thanks very much, Scott. Please, everybody, help me to shout out here to Scott for a very informative presentation. And I would like to move us on now to Stine Grodal, our third presenter, who will talk to us about problematizing categories in qualitative research.
Great. So,
yes, Stine, the floor is all yours. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk in this forum, and thank you very much for your pronunciation of my name, which I know causes a lot of trouble. So I'll just, for those of you who don't know me, that my name is pronounced like this, which is confusing, right? So it's pronounced Stine. And so, as Thomas said, then I'll talk about how we analyze qualitative research. And this is something that is very dear to my heart, although I'd say that half of my work is quantitative and the other half of my work is qualitative. I'm primarily known as a qualitative researcher. I will, however, also try to make some points that are related to quantitative research as well, because I realize that some of the people in this forum might not be qualitative researchers. And so I will just share my here. Sorry. Yes. So you should see my slides now. And so one of I've thought a lot about this question about how do we actually generate theory from data. So when we've collected a lot of qualitative data, how do we actually go about getting to a theoretical contribution? And this also has to do with the fact that a lot of people come to me and they ask, how do I write an A paper? That is, how do I publish in the top journals? how do I have all of this data about some kind of topic, but I don't really know how do I take this data and make it into a contribution. How do I actually generate data from this? And I realized that a lot of people, when they do qualitative research, they get really lost. It's easy to get very lost in the process of analyzing qualitative research because it is so rich and full. And I also realized that the reason that a lot of people got lost is because I think there's a misinterpretation about how we actually analyze, how we actually generate a theory from data in the way that actually I think that qualitative analysis is taught in many, many different methods classes. I think the way that I like to think about this and how I began really also to think about this topic was to begin to think about qualitative analysis as a categorization process. And this, of course, for those of you who know me, has to do with the fact that I've spent a lot of time working on categorization theory. And I began to see the similarities between actually qualitative data analysis on the one hand and categorization theory on the other hand. Because when we conduct qualitative research, what do we actually do? Well, we often have a lot of data about something. It can be interviews, it can be ethnographic observations, but actually nowadays a lot of people also collecting archival research, archival data, media data, social media data, all of these kind of things, which give them these kind of very rich data sets that are actually often very heterogeneous. They have maybe data that is generated by many different kinds of participants, many different kind of communities. They talk in different genres. They might have a panel data set where this the way that people talk about your topic kind of evolves over time. And I've realized that people get kind of very lost in this process. But when coming back to this idea, right, that we really actually that qualitative data analysis is actually a categorization process. Well, think about, those of you who do qualitative analysis, how are you taught to do qualitative analysis? Well, most people are taught to do, say, first we engage in open coding. So we upload all of our data up into some kind of data set and we begin to just open code about different topics that happens there. Then once we've done all of this open coding, have all of these different little codes created, we begin to aggregate them and merge some of them together into second order codes. We might then aggregate those together into these aggregated constructs, right? So we are generating these aggregated constructs or categories based on this qualitative data that we have generated. But I think that most qualitative scholars would agree with that assertion, actually, that doing qualitative analysis is in many ways a categorization process. But the question then kind of, in my mind, came to be like, how do we actually engage in open codings? And do categories always actually emerge, always happen by just merging data, like this going from open coding to second order codes to aggregated construct? Is that really what we're doing? And is that also the best way to write a paper? Is that the best way for you to actually realize what is important in your data? What is actually going on there? And I think, as you might have realized, that that's not the case, right? We actually do not always just aggregate construct. And by doing that, we might actually be leading ourselves astray. So currently, many qualitative papers have begun to kind of employ this, among others, the Joya method. It has become standardized as a template in qualitative methods as a way to signal rigor, that when we do that, we can signal that we did qualitative research in the really, in the right way. And I think that the Joya method can be very useful in certain contexts, and particularly if your data is more homogeneous, it doesn't vary over time, you don't have a lot of different voices speaking. But it is also limited in the sense that it emphasizes that we should only be focusing on merging constructs, and that our basic insights kind of come from this open coding of a lot of different constructs in our data. And so, so together with my co-authors, Michelle Enterby and Audrey Holm, we have a paper where we kind of take a much more, say that what we actually do, when we successfully analyze qualitative data, is to take kind of a much more active approach to data analysis. That is, instead of just kind of blindly open coding our data coding needs to be driven by what puzzles us. What are we puzzled by? What is that we do not understand? And this actually mirrors recent thinking in categorization theory. So recent categorization theory would say, no, categories do not just emerge by merging data and forming aggregated constructs. That's not how people categorize the world. How they categorize the world has to do with, for example, what goals do we have? So we will categorize our world differently depending on the goals that we have. The classical example is that, well, you'd say you normally create categorization kind of in the classical sense by grouping together things that are physically similar. So we group a lot of cups together because they have the same shape and they all have a handle and you can put liquid into them. They have the same physical shape. So that the physical features would mean that all cups are grouped together. However, we might also create groupings based on our goals. For example, if you think about the grouping of things you need to go camping, you might actually create a group that has tents and sleeping bags and boots and mosquito repellent and sun lotion and cooking equipment. They all go together in this category of things I need to go camping. But these physical items, these items are actually not physically similar, right? They're physically very distinct. And yes, it's a very useful and often used category for people. The same way, also, then we create categories based on the kind of the knowledge that we have of the world. In this sense, I think in case of our theories, for example, we will also create categories based on the theoretical framework that we already have. That is what we know in organizational theory, right? The goals that we form when we create qualitative data will have to do also with the goals we have for analyzing the data. Any given data set can be categorized. You can create a nearly infinite amount of categories based on any given qualitative data set, depending on what your goal is. What is it, in my mind, what are you puzzled about? What is it that puzzles you? And so this also goes to the quantitative researchers on the call. I just want to say that I think in general that just needs to be the starting point of any great paper. It needs to be, what are you puzzled about in your data? What is it that you feel this data is telling you that somehow rubs you, that somehow seems inexplicable in some way, and then you need to keep pushing in that direction. I'm very much a fan of context-driven research questions. I think that our best questions comes not from theory. And people might be surprised by this because I think many people see me as a very theoretical scholar. But yet I think it is through our engagement with the real world that we actually begin to ask new questions. Because if we're only working within theory actually often constrains us in the sense that it creates a cognitive lock-in and a frame through which we already understand the world. And it is through the actual phenomenon that we get pushback. I loved Aaron's example of how he had been working priorly on was it basketball, right? And had done videos of those and used that kind of insight to say, hey, maybe that also, I can use that and maybe that can actually play a role in management research. I think that's fabulous, right? This is where insights come from when we begin also to kind of draw on phenomenons we observed. And I think those observations come from everywhere. Our everyday life, our everyday encounters with people, everyday encounters with organizations, everyday encounters with the newspaper. Every day you read something, you should be asking yourself, what is it about this that cannot be explained within existing management theory, right? I mean, I think about this all the time. Every day I go around and think about when I see something like a phenomenon, I'm like, that's weird. that's puzzling. That puzzles me. Like, why do organizations behave in this? And we are all part of these university bureaucracies, right? Bureaucracies puzzle me, right? Like, how do they actually survive? How are they recreated? And I think a lot of those questions come just from everyday life and not necessarily always from theory. Okay, so kind of going back to how do we analyze qualitative data, right? The thing I want you to think about is that we as humans are very active in how we actually engage in the categorization process, depending on our goals, depending on our prior knowledge. It's not just about open coding, right? This is the Joya model, and it's not that, I think in many ways it can be helpful in many ways, but it also has some flaws that I'd like to kind of pull your attention to, right? So you see here the merging structure, right? That the first order concepts go to the second order themes that aggregate, right? So everything aggregate into one another. But many times we might, for example, in qualitative research, discover a concept that is like, you realize that identity is important. This is the first thing you begin to code a lot of things as identity, but over time you realize, well, there are actually many types of identities that are important. Your identity as a mother, your identity as a scholar, your identity as a colleague, your identity as a friend, right? This is actually not aggregation, it's splitting, right? It's taking a concept and making it kind of more granular. So this is one problem. Another problem is in my opinion, is also this whole idea that we can actually open code things, and that open coding is an efficient way for us to generate insights from data. I think it's not true. I think that coding needs to be much more guided. It needs to be guided by a puzzle. If you just open code, you will get completely lost. And I've seen this, I've worked with many students that have been in this situation, that they simply they're open coding. And when you think about this from a theoretical perspective, open coding also violates a lot of our understanding of what is text, right? A text is is open for interpretation, which means that it can be interpreted in multiple different ways by multiple different people, and that any given piece of text can also be understood in multiple different ways. So this is why I have this example, right? And so I'd love to have your participation in saying, well, if we were going to open code this quote, what were the codes that we would generate from this piece of text? I'd love to have some example. People can put into chat some examples of what they would love to, how they might want to open code this particular example. I'm just seeing if I can see where is my chat function even.
Stine, could you reframe once more? What would you like
So, when you do qualitative data analysis, right, you want to open code. So you want to see any kind of different themes that are going on in this. So this could, for example, say, let's take HP. So here I could, for example, generate the code HP, right? Or I could generate the code computer company. Or I could create the code a technology company, technology industry. I could also create the code large corporation, right? And then so you say, for example, the next thing is it's squandering away its corporate R&D and they need a story, right? Here I could create the open code, corporate R&D. I could create I could create the code narrative, right? And they need a story. I could create the code kind of failed strategy. So we have some people here, right? They have R&D, explanations, corporate identity. Are there other ideas? How you'd code some of the things in this quote? I'd of course also then say, you could also have things like phenomenon under study. That's great. You could of course also have like nanotechnology, right? I mean, that's something that's here, right? Graphical tools, recognition and rewards. Somebody suggested new technologies. I think these are all great, right? And so, as you see here, right, there are many, we have things like research, right? There could be something about future, constructing the future, nanotechnology is next. I could have things like labeling dynamic, future, here's time, right? So you think when you begin to, if you really spend time, and now we don't have so much time, looking at this quote, there would be an infinite amount of different themes that you could be generating. And think about the fact that this is just one quote out of, let's say, and this data comes from my dissertation data. And so here for this, my dissertation data, I had 77 interviews. I analyzed about, I think, 500 different, description about nanotechnology. And I had 25 ethnographics observations. And let's say in this little quote, let's say we just were able to generate we could probably easily generate 20 quotes, right? 20 codes. Think about how that explodes when you begin to do that in every single interview that you have, right? It becomes unmanageable. It becomes overwhelming, and we are not making any progress. If you only engage in open coding, you will get lost in data, because the data, any given data set, in my opinion, can tell multiple different stories. And you'd need to understand and decide what is the story that you want to tell. And that has to do with this active role of the researcher, that the researcher needs to focus on the puzzle. And so this is kind of my spiel when we so in this paper, and I don't have kind of time to go through the whole thing, our big emphasis is that, well, we need to understand that as qualitative researchers, it's not that we only inductively open code data and merge them together to form constructs. Instead, what we need to do is to actively focus on the puzzles that we have. So we might go into the data, right, asking a specific question. And based on that question, we will see different theories and have different insights in the data than if we had asked other questions, right? And so, for example, I have a large project that is on the early AIDS epidemic, right? And we're working on 2 different projects on the same data. Our codes are very different because the question that we asked when we went into the data is very different. So one, we asked on, what are the categories that are created? How do people create the category AIDS? And the other question, we had a question about what are the emotions that people have around the AIDS epidemic? And so these very different questions lead us to very different kinds of codes and very different puzzles that were generated in the data. And when we do this kind of coding, we were not just merging things, we were also splitting constructs, and in particularly, we were also dropping a lot of codes, right? Most of the things you'll early on code will be not interesting. Let's say you might have created this code HP, right, in the prior code. It might not have been important. We need to we'll then drop those codes and focus on the thing that seems to be important in the data analysis. And in particular, this also has to do with relating different constructs to one another. It's not just a process of merging constructs together and coming up with that generally merged thing. It's about figuring out what is the relationship between constructs and how are they also sequenced in time. And I think that thinking in this way about qualitative analysis will lead to generate much richer theory, because what we are starting out with is a puzzle. It's something that we feel is inexplicable in the data. It's not just about open coding things that you might see in the data. And so again, I actually think that there are very big similarities between qualitative research and quantitative research, in the sense that even though, Aaron, you talked and you got this question about, like, what if you see something in your data that wasn't, what you designed for it, like, what do we think about p-hacking and all this kind of things? However, I think that every single quantitative study also starts, you get the data and you will end up writing about something, that is maybe not exactly like your original research question, because hopefully the data will inform us, right? The data will show us something that is unanticipated, something that we weren't thinking about before we went into the field, before we collected the data. All of a sudden something is puzzling, and it's through the kind of the following the thing that's puzzling that we will begin to ask new questions that actually move beyond where we were before. And so, for example, in a quantitative study I have a paper that's on the Indiegogo crowdfunding platform, and we were interested in how people generated categories here on the platform. In the beginning, we were just focused on category labels because that's where the research has been. We began then to think about, well, there's also all this text. Maybe people use these textual representations also as a way to generate categories. And so then we included that in our analysis. But then after we actually viewed a lot of these videos and looked a lot at the actual projects that were asking for funding, we began to realize that, nearly all these projects have images and videos. Maybe images and video are actually important in the categorization process, something that categorization scholars have not really examined. And so we went back and we collected a lot of data on videos and images, and our paper is now mainly about that, the role of visuals in the categorization process. But this is just to say that there was something that puzzled us, that was, why do everybody have a video, right? I mean, that was just puzzling. It was not a theoretical question. It was an empirical observation, right? But that led you to a new question in categorization theory by beginning to think, well, if videos and images are so important in the way people communicate, how do we actually form categories based on visual data? And so I think that's a pet peeve of mine for both qualitative and quantitative scholars. Lastly, I'd say for those of you out there who want to do qualitative research, I often get asked, isn't it very risky? And my pet peeve is that I really don't think that it's more risky to publish qualitative research in the top journals than it is to publish quantitative research. I actually think there's a huge potential to make contribution to management theory using qualitative methods. It's just that the devil is in the detail. And I think that the way that I think about qualitative research and the benefits of that is that, you often have a unique data set in comparison to, say, in quantitative research, as Aaron was also talking about, that you have this fear that, we are all just working on the same data set, and the idea I have, somebody else might have it. When you do qualitative research, you're often you have this opportunity to be extremely unique and do something that's different from what everybody else is doing, and that will also benefit you because you will have unique insights and see something that other people are not seeing because they just simply do not have your data. So I just think that qualitative research is not more risky. I just think honestly that sometimes the way that qualitative research is taught can lead people astray. And here I mean especially this thing that you just open code and you have this belief that by open coding and merging constructs together, magically theory is going to arise out of the data as though you had no role in it. And I think that we need to rethink the way that we do qualitative data to say, no, qualitative data analysis is a much more active process that is driven by our existing puzzles and theories. And so when we open code, it's a much more guided process. So before I begin open coding, I need to know what I'm puzzled about. So when I'm, for example, if I was quoting that quote about nanotechnology that I showed before, if I was coding that around I was interested in labeling dynamics as I was in that quote comes from a paper that's about kind of boundaries in emerging fields. If I'm interested in that, I'll be coding very specifically about things that I can see that is related to labeling dynamics. And I'll try to not code things that are not related to that. In a sense, the idea is you cannot start open coding before you know what you're puzzled about. And that also means that before we start open coding, a step in our research process needs to be just sitting down, reading through our transcripts or our archival research or whatever data we have, and spending a lot of time just thinking about what puzzles me here. What does this seem to be the main story that is driving this? You need to, and when you're collecting data, I'm, for example, right now collecting a new data set on electronic cigarettes. And so I'm interviewing a lot of people about their smoking habits. When do you smoke cigarettes? When do you smoke electronic cigarettes? What is the relationship between these two? Is e-cigarettes a disruptive technology? Is it not a disruptive technology? In back of my mind, I'm just like thinking all the time, like, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? Right? What the thing that I'm saying right now, what does it mean in terms of our theory of the model of disruption? Does this fit with Christensen's model of technology disruption, or is this something different, right? What does it tell us about technology adoption? How are they actually adopting this new technology? What is the social process they engage in this, right? And so we need to be constantly thinking and searching for the puzzle, right? What's puzzling here? And that's your main, when you're collecting data, that's just your main, that's your main task. At least one of them, right? While you're collecting the data, this needs to preoccupy you constantly, because the question and the theory is not going to magically emerge from the data. It's going to be driven by your puzzlement and wonderment about what is going on in this data. So that was the end of my presentation. And so good luck.
Great. Thank you very much, Stine, for a really informative presentation. We have a few minutes here for questions from participants. And just as the questions come in, very quick question. The paper you referred to in your presentation, would it be possible also to get the full reference to that paper, because participants might be interested in reading up on that?
Yeah, sure. I can happy to share it.
Okay. So we have a few questions here. What role does theory play when generating categories and questions during data analysis? The first one.
Yeah, no, I think it plays a huge role, right? Because we need to constantly be asking ourselves, how does this data relate to existing theory? Because otherwise, hopefully, when we are coding data, most of the codes we're generating will be replicating existing theories, right? I had this experience coding data from Sun Microsystems, and I was very excited. We were coding about collaboration, and I was looking at, this person does this person does that, this person does this person does that. It's interesting how they kind of share the task. And after a long time doing that, I realized what I had just discovered was, the division of labor, right? Going back to Adam Smith, right? And so if we don't have our theories with us, we are not going to create and write a paper that's going to be interesting and fascinating to read. It's going to be a paper that replicates what all the giants that came before us have already done, right? Most of our data is going to be, in a sense, information in our data is going to be a replication of theories that we already know, things we already know.
Stine, if you could move to the question, I think that's an interesting question here on how you split research 50-50 quantitative and qualitative.
Yeah, so this is not kind of by choice. Most things that kind of happen to me. I think I'm also of qualitative scholars. I always had a fascination for quantitative work too, and always kind of had also for my dissertation collected both qualitative and quantitative research, and so I actually think that a lot of my papers, some of them you might fall into qualitative and others quantitative, but the process is very similar. I would say that some of my papers are kind of closeted, many of them are closeted mixed methods papers, right? Where, because it can be difficult to write and publish a mixed methods paper because you might get either quantitative or qualitative reviewers. Any given paper is written with an emphasis on one of the methods. Meaning that the methods section will either emphasize quantitative methods or qualitative methods, but oftentimes I use both of these tools as a way to generate insights about the data. And so, and part of that, how you evolve your research stream also has to do with, you get students, and since students become interested in doing a quantitative study, and you have to help them, and you end up writing the paper, and so you get kind of pulled into, and being in let's face it, in North America at least, the majority of of people do quantitative research. So as a qualitative scholar, it's easy to become involved in a quantitative project.
Perhaps we have one more question here, a 1-minute answer of how we can avoid preset goals and prior information. Just a few thoughts on that last question.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think we can avoid it. I actually think that we need to embrace it more. We need to embrace the fact that we do have goals and we do have prior knowledge, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. And that this idea that as qualitative researchers, we don't have existing knowledge or goals and that we go in as a tabula rasa is wrong. It's both wrong in terms of this is actually not what we do, but it's also wrong in terms of, in a normative sense, that it will also not lead us to generate the best, the most interesting insights. We need to embrace the fact that we actually go into data analysis with a particular goal in mind, and that it is actually because we're driven by that goal that we might have an insight, because otherwise we'll just be lost in data analysis and we'll replicate all the knowledge that we already have about organizations or industries or fields or whatever we are interested in.
So we might just have to let go of the assumption that human researcher can be free of these biases.
Completely. I don't believe it's possible. I mean, I think that anybody who took Psychology 101 would have to agree with me. I mean, we cannot understand anything if we don't have prior knowledge, right? We can only understand things based on our existing knowledge. And so that knowledge is going to inform the things we do, but that is not necessarily a bad thing, right? I think that people have misunderstood the role when they say rigor in qualitative research. It's meant that, everybody needs to be able to pick up the same data set and come to exactly the same conclusions. I think this is a wrong assumption, because people will take different paths through that data. You give me a data set, I'll see categories, and I can see and write an interesting categorization paper on that. I give it to somebody else, let's say my dear colleague Michel Anteby, and he works on professions. So he picks up a data set and he might write a paper on occupations. Other people might be interested in technology adoption, right? They could write an interesting paper with the same data set on technology adoption, right? There are multiple papers to be written from any given data set, depending on what your goal is and what your interests are, right? And that's does not mean that work wasn't rigorous. It just means that any given data can tell us multiple stories. And I think that's all true for quantitative research too, right? I mean, look at the patent data set and how many papers have been written, right? I mean, it just means that people can take the same data and use it to ask multiple different questions. And that is true for quantitative and qualitative research.
I would love to continue this conversation, but we are out of time for today's session. Stine, thank you again very much. And many thanks also to Scott, Tonidandel, and to Aaron Hill again for a set of wonderful presentations. And thanks everybody who participated here today. As usually, we will share the slides after the session, and we will be back next Wednesday when we will talk about longitudinal and process studies design issues. Thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.